Welcome to this new video on the Reddit Storylane. A divided family, a daughter's journey to independence. It is never easy to admit that your family treated you differently, that your own blood reduced you to a shadow of someone else, someone who seemed to have all the doors open while you were left with the key that no longer fit the lock. But what happens when you finally realize that, despite everything you've done to prove your worth, your parents' love was never for you, but for someone who was always their ideal projection? This is the story of a girl who had to face the reality of a family that never treated her as an equal, a girl who, despite her determination and achievements, found herself increasingly excluded from the family nucleus, relegated to a second-class role. Her experiences reflect a malaise that afflicts many families: one-sided love, favoritism, and a silent struggle for identity in a world that always seems to favor someone else. Since I was little, I always felt a distance between me and my brother Adam, a distance that grew without anyone really acknowledging it. I don't know if it was something innate, or if it was the result of a turbulent period that marked our lives differently. But when it happened, I started to notice the difference. It wasn't just about small gestures of attention, but something deeper, something that made me feel like I belonged to a different family. I remember the days when Adam, despite being caught selling drugs, received understanding from my parents. "He's just going through a rough time," they would say. Then, when they caught me smoking marijuana, everything changed. It wasn't just a youthful mistake anymore, but a disaster that would threaten our entire family. My parents' reaction was violent and incomprehensible. They saw Adam as a boy trying to find himself, while they made me feel as if I had exploded something irreparable. The inequality didn't stop there. It kept growing, rooting itself deeper into our family. Adam, the golden child, never worried about finishing college, finding a stable job, or committing to anything. But he was always excused, always protected. I remember that, despite his failures, my parents would say that he was just trying to find his way, while I, who had always tried to be perfect, was criticized for not doing enough. Yet, somehow, their constant disapproval of me never seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. After graduation, when I finally landed a job as a technical writer at 22, I thought it was my time to shine. I felt fulfilled, but that happiness didn't last long. Another blow came when I learned that, despite becoming independent, my parents had taken away my health insurance. It wasn't a reward for my autonomy, but a way to show me that, now that I had a job, I had to fend for myself. Meanwhile, Adam, at 26, was still receiving support from my parents while I was forced to deal with the world on my own, with no help. The economic disparity wasn't just about money. It was a symbol of how my parents saw me and, without even realizing it, made me feel like a burden. When Adam decided to move to Colorado and never worked for a long period, my parents made sure he had everything he needed. His life seemed like one long vacation, while I struggled to survive. When I lost my job in 2023 due to a company reorganization, the situation worsened. I no longer had a steady income, and out of necessity, I was forced to move back in with my parents. The greatest pain wasn't so much having to go back home, but the fact that, despite always trying to do everything the right way, my parents never did anything but make me feel like a failure. When I finally got a new job in May, something unexpected happened. My parents, after helping me out at home, asked me to pay a retroactive rent of $10,000. They had never mentioned rent before, but now that I had a job, it seemed like the right time to make me pay for the time I had spent there. The hardest moment came when my parents, completely naturally, told me they wouldn't pay for my ticket to the long-awaited Thanksgiving cruise. They reminded me that I now had a job and could afford to pay for myself. But what enraged me wasn't so much that they asked me to pay, but how they justified it. "Adam is still trying to find himself," they would say, while he continued living a life without responsibilities. I couldn't understand why he deserved special treatment, while I had to fight for every little thing. That made me feel invisible. I had spent years making sacrifices, trying to earn my parents' approval, and yet now they were asking me to cover my own costs while my brother, who had never shown any commitment, was treated as a priority. That was when I decided to say enough. But what enraged me wasn't so much that they asked me to pay, but how they justified it. Adam is still trying to find himself, they would say, while he continued living a life without responsibilities. I couldn't understand why he deserved special treatment, while I had to fight for every little thing. That made me feel invisible. I didn't tell them right away, but when the morning of departure came, with my phone vibrating with insistence and messages, I responded firmly, "Have a great trip with your favorite son. I'll spend my Thanksgiving with Tom's family." Spending Thanksgiving with Tom and his family was a life-changing experience. But what enraged me wasn't so much that they asked me to pay, but how they justified it. Adam is still trying to find himself, they would say, while he continued living a life without responsibilities. I couldn't understand why he deserved special treatment, while I had to fight for every little thing. That made me feel invisible. Despite the serenity I had found, I couldn't avoid the messages and calls that kept coming from my parents. When I finally answered my mother, her voice was full of accusation. "You ruined Thanksgiving, Sarah. Did you really miss it that much?" The weight of her words crushed me, but I could no longer accept the role they had assigned me my whole life. I was no longer willing to live to please others. I needed to be myself, without constantly proving I was good enough. My happiness would never again depend on their approval. In the weeks that followed, I began to reflect on my relationship with my parents. Every encounter, every unspoken word, every heavy silence made me realize that maybe, to protect myself, I had to distance myself. And so, with a heavy heart but also a surprising sense of liberation, I started to consider cutting ties with them. This wasn't an easy decision, but I realized that, for the first time in my life, I had the right to choose what was best for me. Sarah's story is not unique. Many of us grow up in families where love is distributed unevenly, where expectations and favoritism leave deep scars. But what this story teaches us is that, in the end, we should no longer let others define who we are. The true family is the one that accepts us for who we are, unconditionally. And to find that family, sometimes we need to be ready to free ourselves from the emotional chains that bind us to those who have always seen us as secondary.